I'm Callie Crossley, and this is Under the Radar with Callie Crossley. And now for the part of the show we call Lagniappe. That's Creole for something extra. In Star Trek, the beloved science fiction series, Mr. Spock traveled across the galaxy as the first officer of the Starship Enterprise. But the late Leonard Nimoy, the real-life actor who portrayed Spock, had roots right here in Boston. This year, the Star Trek franchise observes its 50th anniversary, and fans around the world are honoring the legacy of both the Spock character and actor Leonard Nimoy. Author Richard Michelson paid tribute to his longtime friend in his new young adult book called Fascinating, The Life of Leonard Nimoy. And Rich Michelson joins me now. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Callie. It's great to be back here.
Well, for people who might have been under the rock for the last 50 years and don't know the Spock character at all, your title of your book has special meaning. Fascinating is something that he said a lot, and I want to give people a chance to hear actor Leonard Nimoy in the role of Mr. Spock using the word.
Well, fascinating is a word I use for the unexpected. Fascinating. 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 A most fascinating thing happened, but it would be a fascinating project.
So we can see there, boy, what an actor he is, that he was able to say it so many different ways as well.
You know how I got the title, at least, right?
Exactly. So I love it because you took a little bit from his, fictional life and used fascinating. And then the rest of the title is really referring to him as a real person, Leonard Nimoy, the actor. Right. Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, Leonard and I, as you know, were very close friends. We traveled together probably for the last 12 years of his life. We spoke daily. And he was a great photographer. In my other life, I am a gallerist, and I handled his career. So we traveled the country together. And we spent a lot of meals, a lot of evenings sitting around talking about our childhoods, various ideas that we had, et cetera. And what is strange to me is that I didn't think to write about this book sooner because I write a lot of children's books. I write about a lot of well-known and less well-known people. I think I was on your show many years ago with another book. And I also facilitated many interviews for Leonard. Everybody found his life fascinating. But it really wasn't until he and his son Adam were working on a documentary called Leonard Nimoy's Boston. And they were going through the old jaunts, his old neighborhood. He grew up on the West End here, went to the Elizabeth Peabody House, which is where this book starts, that I started to realize that this is a story that the next generation should hear about. It's a story about an immigrant family. It's especially relevant today. It's a story about how Leonard brought his background here in Boston to the character of Spock and how much he put of himself into the role.
One of the things about the character of Spock, he was half human and half Vulcan, and so he expressed a lot of that in the stories as they were told, both in the TV series that went on for some time and then in the feature films. There is a ready audience for looking at this man, this actor, and this character in many different ways. I was thinking about that as you approached the story. And you just talked about his Boston roots and how that influenced him in the shaping of the character. But you say that this is not a celebrity book, just to be clear. So I want you to talk about that.
No, it's not. It's a book about somebody whose life experiences, I hope, are going to influence and encourage the next generation. We're having this debate today about this immigrant culture, and Leonard reached for the stars. He didn't let things hold him back. He was an outsider in many ways. And so it's a book about the man, primarily. It does end with him getting the role of Spock in Star Trek, and it shows how much of himself he brought to that role.
Well, tell us a little bit about it. Don't tell the key thing, which is which is about the gesture. I'm going to save that. But tell us about ways in which he lifted from his own life to create this character of Spock.
Sure. Well, Leonard's parents both came to this country escaping pogroms in Zaslav, Ukraine. His mother was actually smuggled out in a hay cart. His dad walked for many days to cross a border. And when they came to this country, in fact, we have their papers, which were stamped at the time alien. They were aliens in this country. And Leonard certainly experienced anti-Semitism growing up. And his immediate neighborhood was a lot of Polish, a lot of Italians, a lot of Irish. But as soon as he left his few blocks, he often experienced anti-Semitism. And most of his friends were not Jewish. So he felt very much like an outsider. He saw the fear that his parents had in their day-to-day life. They were fearful people. And they, as many people who escape pogroms and come here, they would advise him, keep your head down, just work hard, but don't make a fuss. They didn't want him to be an actor. They were not people who were comfortable with the limelight. On the other hand, his grandparents, his grandmother spoke Yiddish, never learned English, and Leonard, in fact, was a native Yiddish speaker. In fact, a little sideline is when he did finally move to Hollywood, years later, he actually hired a psychiatrist to go to once every couple of weeks, not because he wanted to talk about his problems, but because she spoke Yiddish.
Oh,
and
wow.
he wanted to have an hour every couple of weeks to speak in Yiddish. But, some people, when they escape, they take the route of his parents, don't make a fuss, blend in. On the other hand, his grandparents, who escaped a similar situation, took the other end of the ball, and they would say to him, you never know what tomorrow's going to bring. Reach for the stars. Go for it. And his grandfather especially was a hero and a role model to Leonard.
I have a little bit of tape from an interview that my arts contributor, Alicia Anstead, did actually at your studio some years ago when Leonard had a photography exhibit. And she got him to talk about his parents, his mother particularly. So let's hear Leonard Nimoy talk about his parents and his mother.
Immediately put me in mind of my mother, who was a very strong figure, not a very social figure. She was a rather reclusive, actually, but she was a very strong force in my life, much more so than my father, who was rather retiring and quiet, hardworking, very hardworking man. Most of his life was spent doing the work to support a family.
So you just made it clear that his parents were not thrilled when he came up with the idea of being an actor.
His father, when he insisted on going to Hollywood, the last thing his father told him is, learn to play the accordion. Actors starve, but at least musicians, there's always a need for a musician.
I think the accordion is an interesting instrument that he selected. The thing about Star Trek, that if people are not familiar with it, is that everybody on that ship really were outsiders, if you will. They were all immigrants. And that's what Gene Roddenberry, who thought of it, wanted, a world in which people were represented from everywhere.
And Leonard really, I think people know, that was important to him. He lived his life outside of the show with the same ideals. He always fought for the underdog. He put his money where his mouth is. He supported Israeli-Palestinian groups that tried to work together. He supported young artists. And many of the Star Trek folks will tell you, and one of the pleasures for me of working with this book was meeting a number of them, is how Leonard went to bat for them as well. When the show did become a hit and they were paying him and Bill Shatner more money, he stood up for the other members of the cast and said, we are a group. When the cartoon version of the Star Trek was unveiled, originally they had just hired Leonard and Bill Shatner, and somebody else did all the other characters. And Leonard said, this show is about inclusion. if you don't hire everyone, I'm not in it. And so he stood up for his ideals. And that's another thing that you see in the character Spock.
I think what many people may not know, and let me first say that if you're just tuning in, this is Under the Radar with Callie Crossley, and my guest is Rich Michelson. He's author of a new young adult book, Fascinating: The Life of Leonard Nimoy. Rich wrote the book in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of the Star Trek series, which is this year, but also in tribute of his longtime good friend. He was a triple threat. He was an actor, he was a singer, he was a writer. But again, as you say, a lot of that started right here with establishing the kind of ideals that he had that carried him, not only just through his life, but through that character. I'd like you to read a little bit from the book, if you would.
Sure.
Something that sort of tells us a little bit more about the young Leonard.
Well, this page that I'm going to read actually is also appropriate for reading this time of year. It takes place during the High Holy Days and when Leonard was going to synagogue. Most all of the kids in the building got along, but every Sunday Lenny felt left out when his friends went to church. Still, he felt special when his father took him to shul. On Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, Lenny watched the men in front start swaying and singing a special prayer. "We're supposed to cover our eyes during the priestly blessing," Max whispered. "You don't look, no cheating." Lenny peeked. He was fascinated by what he saw. The men pulled their prayer shawls over their heads, but their chants only got louder. As they blessed the congregation, they raised both arms in the air and held out their hands as if they were shooting a two-handed jump shot. What were they doing with their fingers? Fascinating. He couldn't ask, or his father would know he disobeyed. That night, in his room, Lenny practiced what he'd witnessed. He taped together his index finger and his middle finger, then his pinky and his ring finger. By the time of his bar mitzvah, Lenny could make that gesture easily with either hand. His fingers looked like the letter Shin, which he'd learned in Hebrew school was the first letter of the word shalom, or peace, and Shaddai, one of the names for God.
So the symbol is called a trident, as I understand, and he, developed that, and people will recognize from your reading that that's the gesture that he used when he said, "Live long and prosper."
Yes.
That's where it came from.
And that is a gesture that many people don't realize he introduced to Star Trek during the second season of the show. It was the first time that we were visiting back to the planet Vulcan, and Leonard was supposed to meet the Vulcan Queen, and the script actually had him walk up and shake hands. And Leonard said, we should have a different greeting. Asians bow, military men salute. But he hadn't thought ahead, so the director said, well, what do Vulcans do? And Leonard didn't quite know. And then this vision came to him, and he reached back into his childhood, and he raised his hand in this gesture that became world famous and said, "Live long and prosper." And he says that he knew immediately he had touched a nerve. As soon as that program aired, he walked out on the street and people would walk up to him and make that gesture. And one of the great pleasures of his life, he always said, was that most people didn't realize that wherever he went, they were blessing him and they were blessing each other. And he was blessing them back. And that was very important to him.
Oh, that's so touching. I'm speaking with Rich Michelson. He's the author of Fascinating: The Life of Leonard Nimoy, and we're celebrating Leonard Nimoy, the actor who created Spock, his life and legacy. Leonard Nimoy died about 1.5 years ago. What you've been talking about that you explained very much in the book and that we've heard many times about this great actor and man is that he really was loyal and supportive of all around him, if you've just given that example. I wanted us to take a listen to something that he said to Alicia Anstead a few years ago about, in addition to his childhood helping him and his faith come up with the gesture, "Live long and prosper," the whole idea of his relationship with William Shatner, the actor who played Captain Kirk, came from also a childhood experience, and here it is.
When I was a kid, The Lone Ranger was a very popular radio show, and then became films. And The Lone Ranger had what was known as a sidekick, a buddy, who worked with him and helped him and traveled with him, it was an Indian named Tonto, an American Indian named Tonto. When we played Lone Ranger, the kids on the street, I played Tonto. I chose to play Tonto. I didn't see myself as the Lone Ranger. But Tonto had special qualities. Tonto was loyal, he was dependable, he was responsible, and he had certain talents that were useful to the Lone Ranger. He could put his ear to the railroad track and tell you when the train was going to arrive. He could take a look at the tracks on the ground and tell you how many people had passed this way, which direction they were going, and how fast they were moving by the imprint of the hoof prints of their horses.
There it is. He used everything in his life.
He did. He often played Native Americans, obviously, early on, and often was cast as the outsider. But he was, an accomplished actor when he got the role of Star Trek. It was not out of nowhere. He had been working for 13 years in various roles. He had started an acting studio where he taught younger actors himself. And, it was not easy. There's an incident in the book where I mentioned, he was a soda jerk. He drove a cab. He was about to return home once when he picked up somebody in his cab, and he heard a familiar Boston accent, and he started to feel homesick. And he was talking to his passenger and saying that he was thinking of going home. And he was told, never give up as long as you can make a difference in people's lives. And that passenger, as he got out of the cab, handed Leonard his card, and it was Senator John F. Kennedy at the time. Wow. And that was also an important part of Leonard's life. So it's funny how all these things come together.
I'm talking with my guest, Rich Michelson, whose new book is Fascinating: The Life of Leonard Nimoy. So I mentioned that he's an actor, a singer, also a photographer. He had almost a whole other career as a photographer, quite a serious one.
He was not a dilettante. Again, in the book, we see him getting his first camera as a 13-year-old boy. It was, and it also had an effect on his life. He lived in a tiny apartment in Chambers Street with 3 generations of Nimoys, and he turned a bathroom into a dark room, which didn't make anybody else too happy. But through looking through that viewfinder, he would study people's faces, and he would see for the first time how his father hid his emotions and how his grandfather had a twinkle in his eye. And it got him to really study people. There's a part in the book where he talks about developing the pictures and seeing souls being unveiled. And throughout his life, he continued to take pictures. A lot of people do not know that after Star Trek was canceled after 3 seasons, Leonard seriously considered becoming a professional photographer. He actually went back to UCLA. He studied photography.
And we should say that he's exhibited at your gallery, and currently you have an exhibit called
We currently have an exhibit, Unseen, 50 previously unseen photographs in honor of 50 years of Star Trek. And you can see that he took.
Yes.
He did, he continued to take pictures throughout his life. We've done numerous shows. He has books that he's done. He considered himself a photographer, and
he was,
and he was,
yes,
and
an artist,
and
in that
oftentimes that was his main passion for long periods of time, and he's an amazing photographer. I really encourage people to check out. You can go to leonardnimoyphotography.com, and you'll get a sense of the range of his work. He's had numerous shows. We did a great show in conjunction with Mass Mocha, which was their best attended show ever. He has laurels and laudits as a photographer. He was a Renaissance man. Leonard, just to be around him was an amazing experience. He loved art. He loved literature. He flew his own plane. He was interested in everyone. When you met him, he wanted to know about you. And one of the photography projects we did at the gallery was called Secret Selves, where he took portraits of over 100 people as the half of themselves they don't show to the world. And hearing him talking to each of these people was an amazing experience. He drew out things from them that they didn't know were in him himself.
So, Rich, when you started the book, you were going to write it and not tell him about it until it was done. I hear that changed, which was good, so he got a chance to see it in the end. I'd like to know what his response to it was.
I didn't want to tell him I'm writing the book because I was afraid, well, what if I didn't finish it? What if I didn't love it? I didn't want him asking, hey, how's the book coming along? But in actuality, I finished it Thanksgiving morning, 2014. I read it over, and I knew it worked. I knew I had what I wanted. I knew I was going to be able to sell this project. So I emailed it to Leonard that morning, as was his wont. 5 minutes later, he emailed me back. He was, as mentioned in the book, the most faithful correspondent I ever had. We emailed daily for the last 10 years of his life. I could always count on him. And he said, I'm flattered. This is lovely. Thank you so much for doing this. I knew he had been ill. I had no idea that he only had 3 months to live at that time. I'm so glad that I finished it in that period of time. He wrote back to me after he finished his turkey with a few changes, factual things. I had forgotten the name of the temple he had gone to of his third grade best friend. He had a few word changes, which were very helpful. And in fact, the last conversation we ever had together was about this book. I had told him that he was in the hospital. I said, you best get better. We have a big book tour coming up. And the last words he said to me were, don't worry, Rich, I'll be there with you. And
that's really quite lovely.
In fact, it's not the way I had hoped,
yes,
but he is with me every day.
The Star Trek feature film series has been rebooted by J.J. Abrams, and the last one was this year, Star Trek Beyond, which was, all of them have been quite good, and they did a lovely tribute to him in the film at the end. But I wonder, from your viewpoint as someone who's known him through, now you know him through his childhood, for having written about it, through his work as a photographer, his other work as an artist, and certainly as Spock and not Spock, as he himself thought of himself. What do you think is going to be memorable about Leonard Nimoy?
Leonard had so many gifts, and traveling around the country as I am with this book, it's amazing how many lives he's touched and how many people feel so close to him, like they really know him. It's a wonderful thing. They understand the authenticity behind the character. They understand how much of himself he's brought to every character he's played, not only Spock, but numerous Broadway roles, other acting roles. They get a sense that there's a real person behind there. And in the end, I think he's a champion to everyone who feels like an outsider at some point, which is pretty much all of us, I think, at most times of our lives. I do think his memory will, dare I say it, live long and prosper.
Thank you so much, Rich Michelson. Rich Michelson is the author of Fascinating: The Life of Leonard Nimoy. He's the owner of the R. Michelson Gallery in Northampton, Massachusetts, which is currently showing an exhibit of Leonard Nimoy's photography called Unseen: 50 Photographs That Have Never Been Seen Before, shot by Leonard Nimoy. Well, that's it for this edition of Under the Radar with Callie Crossley. Come back next Sunday at 6 p.m. for another hour of the stories you may have missed. In the meantime, you can find our show and stories we talked about today online at wgbhnews.org/UTR. You can also subscribe to our podcast at iTunes and write to us at undertheradar@wgbh.org. Our engineers are John Parker and Doug Sugarts. Our producer is Jason Tereski. Under the Radar with Callie Crossley is a production of WGBH.